Hi, everybody. As usual, the books I'm going to be talking about will be timestamped in the description below. Ship of Destiny by Robin Hobb is the third and final book in the Live Ship Traders trilogy. And what I could say about this book, spoiler free, I'll give you a few different bullet points about it. One is that I noticed that there were quite a few rescue missions at play in a few different storylines. And so everything is culminating, everything is building in that last installment. And then I also noticed that there were at least three different storylines where we have characters who are using deception in order to assert a certain amount of power. So they're trying to deceive the people around them with how much power they have. And if they make one mistake, then they could fall off that tightrope and everything can collapse underneath them. And I feel like this was an interesting way to build tension, but it was interesting to see how it differed from different storylines, but how it was employed in different storylines. And lastly, I'll say that I enjoyed my reading experience of this book quite a bit. I found myself very immersed. I found it was quite the page turner for me personally, but I did find the end was a struggle for me, especially with one storyline. And if you want to hear spoiler filled thoughts about what that is and my critiques of it, then I'm going to point you to Derry's channel from Derry's Read It Before. I had a fantastic discussion with Derry and Bookborn about it. And it was interesting because we all had, well, Bookborn and I think more or less shared some of the same critiques. There were some differences too, and then Derry had a different perspective. And so I think it was a very balanced discussion all around. But I invite you to check that out. And overall, I'm still in high praise of the trilogy, even though it didn't quite reach the heights I was expecting. I was expecting this to be really high on my list of favorite series of all time, and I don't know how high I'd put it right now, but it's not quite as high as I had expected, but I'm still excited to continue, and I'm still in awe of what Hop does as a writer. So, I think actually because I felt a little bit more negative about the ending of Ship of Destiny, I think I am going to try to prioritize Fool's Errand because I've heard such phenomenal praise for that trilogy and for Fool's Errand specifically. So I don't want to stop and wait a while with feeling mixed about the ending of a trilogy. I'd rather just continue on and continue the momentum for the things that I'm loving in Hobbs' writing right now. And it was interesting, by the way, because in that spoiler-free review I did comparing Farseer trilogy and Live Ship Traders trilogy, I felt like there were quite a few people in the comment section who prefer the Fitz books over Live Ship. And that surprised me, honestly, because I always thought that people preferred live ship over Farseer. I don't know if it's exactly the case in which people prefer live ship traders or Farseer, but I think in general, people love the Tawny Man trilogy the most. That's the vibe I'm getting, but I'm not sure if that's totally accurate. That's just what my impression is from the response to that video. I'm curious though. I'm curious to read on and see how I feel. The Day Boy and the Night Girl by George MacDonald was published in 1879. This is a classic fairy tale. So, this story is about a witch who wanted to know everything, and she ends up somehow persuading two expectant mothers, two pregnant women, to her castle to come to her castle. One gives birth to a boy, and once that woman gives birth to the baby boy, the witch lies to the mother and says your child died and sends her away, and she keeps the baby boy. And then with the other mother is blind and gives birth to a girl. So what this witch does is she keeps the boy in one area of the castle grounds, and then she keeps the girl in a different area. The boy is raised only to know daytime. He is never to see the night sky, and the girl is kept in a dark room with a lamp, and she is never to know daylight. And what happens is that we fast forward to when these kids are about 15, 16 years old, and they end up they discover the opposite side of the day cycle, and they end up discovering one another. And one thing that I'll never forget, because this was a reread for me, I read this when I was about 15, 16 years old, so it was perfect because I was about the age as the girl in the story. When I was of that age, I'll never forget the wonder and the the description, the power of the description that MacDonald provides when describing when the girl goes outside at night and sees the night sky for the first time and sees the mother of lamps, the moon in the sky and the stars around her. And just the way that MacDonald wrote that description, it spoke to me, and I could easily put myself in those shoes of what would it be like to see the night sky for the first time? Because when I was a teenager, I used to love looking at the stars. I used to love going on my roof and just spending time at night looking up. So there was just something so wondrous, so magical about that and reading that experience. And I also appreciate McDonald's wordplay. He does little things, little turns of phrase. Like, for example, the girl has a lamp and she's told that the lamp might go out, and she's wondering in her head, if the lamp goes out, where does it go? It's just a little fun, whimsical wordplay here and there. And so I really enjoyed this story. I enjoyed what MacDonald evoked through his prose, beautiful prose. And there's something about this time of year that makes me interested in that kind of approach to writing, and that makes me enjoy the idea of a whimsical fairy tale. And so this was just so beautifully written. I think it's a powerful exploration of discovery, of gender identity, I think can be explored a bit in this story as well. And, yeah, I just thought it was a light, fun, whimsical fairy tale story that I would recommend if you're ever in the mood for that kind of thing. The Castle of Lear by Lloyd Alexander is a middle grade fantasy series. I believe it's Welsh inspired, and I've been enjoying this series as a palate cleanser through audiobook. I love the audiobook narrator for this series. And what I would say about it is it follows all of the fantasy tropes that you can imagine. We are following an assistant pig keeper named Taran, and he ends up going on a journey in the first book, and he meets a group of friends who become his found family. And, in this 3rd installment, the princess character, Eilonwy, she ends up needing to leave Caer Dallben, where they're all located. She needs to go to a castle on this island, and she needs to train to become a proper princess. And I love Eilonwy's character because she's always speaking in similes, and she's always reminding Taran that he is an assistant pig keeper and that this is nothing to be ashamed of. This is something to be proud of. And I just enjoy her dialogue quite a bit. But she goes to this castle, her group of friends go with her, and she ends up getting kidnapped. So most of the story is Taran and his friends going about trying to save the princess. And then we get some interesting reveals to Princess Eilonwy's magical bauble, which is a magical object that she keeps close to her. And there's also some reveals surrounding a book, a magical book. And so this was a fun time, I would say. I mean, I'm not the target audience as this is middle grade fantasy and it's very trope heavy, but I enjoy that, and I enjoy the classic fantasy aspect of the story. I think that Lloyd Alexander is an excellent writer. I think he was an excellent writer. Um, and so I think he used his words beautifully to convey this type of story, and I enjoy the dialogue. But the thing is, I most prefer these stories whenever Princess Eilonwy is on the page, especially her dynamic with Taran. And in this one, we didn't get that as much because she was kidnapped for most of the story. But that said, it's been fun to see the progression of the characters because you could tell that Taran and Eilonwy are growing, and you get the sense that there's a budding romance that maybe they're not even conscious of. There's a little bit of jealousy that comes into the story and a little bit of conflict with that. I will say that I preferred book 2, The Black Cauldron, which is the book that Disney made a movie based on. And I preferred that because it was a bit darker in tone, and I loved what the story did. I thought it was a much more interesting story. It deals with necromancy, with these corpses that are brought back to life in a cauldron and created to become an army of the dead. It's really well done, in my opinion. But this installment, like I said, I think it was a good progression of the story, and maybe I'll get to the next one sometime later this year. White Nights by Dostoyevsky. This edition, this little Black Classics edition, it has 2 stories. It has White Nights, and it also has one called Bubbock. And I'll quickly talk about Bubbock. It's shorter, and it didn't leave quite as big an impression on me, but I'll quickly say it's a satirical gallows humor story that is all about the dead talking, and it certainly has some social class commentary, and it's also focused on the ways that we live our lives and what that means when we die, I think. I guess there are other things that could probably be said about it, but like I said, it didn't leave quite as big an impression on me as White Knights, the first story. So White Knights is on the surface a sentimental love story, a unrequited love story, and yet I feel like this story is doing so many things I love. So this is told in first person from a nameless narrator. He is walking the streets of St. Petersburg in the advent of spring, and he's taking note of all of his surroundings. He's describing the buildings and the people, he's personifying the setting, and then he comes across a woman in need. And this girl, she's being stalked by a predator, so he intervenes and they start to talk very awkwardly at first. And he leans into that awkwardness because he is quite the eccentric character. And if you've ever read Dostoevsky before, then you'd know that he excels at writing eccentric characters. And so this character, he explains to her that he is lonely. He lives alone. He doesn't interact with anyone, and he is desperate for social interaction. And not only that, but he's a dreamer. He describes himself as a dreamer, as somebody who spends his time in his imagination, in this world of wonder, with himself as the main hero of his story, and seeing the world in this way is it sounds fantastical and beautiful and incredible, and it perhaps even evokes a true heartfelt connection with life, but at the same time, he starts to realize that year after year, nothing real becomes of that way of living. And he yearns for that. He's ready to step out of his dream because he's so thirsty for real human interaction, for conversation. And this girl, she can't help but be charmed by him and the fact that he cannot speak plainly at all. And she sees that he's sincere at heart, but she also lets him know, and I think this is important, that he is his own worst enemy. I feel like that's an important line in the story. And she makes a deal with him that if he promises to not to fall in love with her, and if he promises to give her his brotherly advice, that she will forever be grateful and tell him what is troubling her and open up to him and give him the connection, I suppose, the friendship that he's wanting. And of course, we know that certain promises cannot be kept at a heartfelt level. And so that's, I think, something really explored in the story. We do get the exploration of being a dreamer, living in your dreams versus living in reality and what you're sacrificing for that. And then we're also getting a sense of the way people at the time are living their lives. So I think there's some social commentary that's inserted in the subtext of that. And also, I think that this is about promises that we just can't keep, that we might try to make with the best of intentions, but that our hearts can't keep. And so this ends up leading to some twists in the story, and I loved it. I just adored the way that these characters interacted, the dialogue. I thought there was such an interesting tonal contrast between this quite eccentric, I would say neurotic character that we follow and the female character that he interacts with. And, I mean, she seems to be so much different than he is. Definitely far more centered, but her life is a little strange at the same time. Like, she talks about her grandmother living with her blind grandmother who pins their skirts together so that she won't get in trouble. So it has an interesting kind of old wives folkish vibe when it comes to that. It goes in an interesting direction, not super unpredictable by any means, but I just loved it. I talked my mother into reading this because I just needed somebody to talk to about it. And what was interesting about it is that while we had the same takeaways about the themes and what Dostoevsky was doing, at the same time, we had very different interpretations of the end. I saw the end in a much more dark way than she did, and she saw it in a much more hopeful way than I did, and I could see both interpretations being possible. But I'm also kinda surprised that we had such different interpretations. One other thing I'll quickly say about it too is that I feel like Dostoyevsky writes in such a theatrical way. I read Crime and Punishment last year, and I felt very similarly about that book as I did about this. Of course, Crime and Punishment is more deeply layered when it comes to philosophy, social commentary, and rich, deep psychological exploration. It's still a book worth appreciating for sure. But I just loved what White Nights did. It brought me so much that I was looking for in a short story, especially one that deals with romantic love, which is a topic I've been thinking about a lot lately. Something I forgot to mention is that I picked this book up thanks to Vera's channel. If I didn't say this already, I finished this book on my birthday and it left such an impression on me. And then later on, I started writing out my thoughts and I found I just had so much I wanted to say about it. So I'm very excited to do so now, and I'll go ahead and say it. This is my gem of the month in the month of August. Even though it's a short story, I think a short story can still pack a big punch, and I'm so glad I got to it. Next book I have to talk about comes with a conflict of interest warning, and that is because it is written by a friend of mine, somebody I consider a good friend here on BookTube, and that is Tori Tekken's Cold Silver for Souls, a Western fantasy story. So if you're uncomfortable with a friend reviewing a friend's book, which I can understand, then you might want to bounce off of my review and go check out a review from somebody who has no conflict of interest with Tori. And also, Tori gifted me this gorgeous Storm of Swords edition for my birthday. I'm touched by her generosity too with that book, with that gift, and with this book because she did gift me this edition as well of Cold Silver for Souls. That out of the way. Okay, so if you're still here and still interested in my thoughts, this is a fantasy Western story. We follow a necromancer named Hunter. Hunter is a bounty hunter, and she lugs around a corpse named Rip. We don't know where Rip came from, how she came about tying him to her, but she does have this gift. And so she is somewhat of an outcast in society because necromancy is a dark art. And as we get to know her, we start to realize that even though she's committed to this dark magic and she's a bounty hunter, which is not exactly a noble job, she still has certain people who know her deeply and care about her and see the good in her. And you realize that she also has a moral code, which is important because I think one of the big themes that is that is brought up in the story, especially towards the end, is the difference between the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law, if you've heard that phrase before. So, when we're looking at the spirit of the law versus the letter of the law, we're focusing on whether we are more concerned with the purpose of why the law is there in the first place, or if we just want to make sure we're following the law because we're supposed to follow the law. So, I feel like that's explored a little bit in the story. And I mentioned conflict of interest, and actually that's brought up in the story too, when the people who are there doling out justice or deciding who should be persecuted, if they're in some ways being incentivized by money, how that affects interpretation of law and justice. So that's brought up in the story as well. And let's see what else. This takes place in a Western mining town called Silver City. And I really appreciated the subtle world building because Tori doesn't necessarily build from scratch a whole new world. You get the sense this is basically like an old Western setting in the US almost, although it's not. There is a religion that seems to be Christianity because I think they have crosses, but then there is also mention of a different religion that's not Christian. So there's some interesting things with the world building. And I also appreciated the landscape settings of the mountains. There's this cathedral mountain range, which I thought was a really cool description of a mountain range, and the territories surrounding it with the old mining haunts. So there's some nice description there, also the bitter cold climate. Otherwise, one thing I'll say is that the story is quite episodic. You get a few chapters at a time of Hunter's events. I guess there is a bit of a through line, but it feels like Hunter is the through line for the most part. And I will say that I didn't quite connect to this story for the first quarter, I really struggled to get into it, not because it was lacking in characterization. I think that Hunter had a certain depth of character in the sense that we always get her quoting things that her mother said or her father said. Her parents seem to be long past when we start the story. But I struggled to connect to Hunter because I didn't sense any internal conflict. I didn't get a sense of what she was troubled by or what her hopes were, what her dreams were, or anything she was concerned about or worried about. I just got the sense that she was doing her job. And where Hunter started to come together for me as a character, where I started to feel more of a connection for her, is in the middle part of the story. In the middle part of the story, she interacts with more friends. She meets a young boy and connects to this boy, and that brings out a different side of her. And I really appreciated the way that was handled in the story. So that was what I appreciated the most, was that middle section. And then the other thing I'll say is that there are some action sequences, and, I'm just picky when it comes to action sequences, so it wasn't my favorite part of the story. It wasn't necessarily a part of the story I connected with, but I did appreciate the Western tropes that were leaned into, like people with pitchforks, and again, some of the setting descriptions were well done. So, yeah, those are my thoughts on Tori Tekken's book. It did leave me with a lot of questions unanswered, and there were a couple of cameos from a couple of booktubers. Maybe I shouldn't give away who those are in case people want to read and find out, though it might be pretty obvious if you read it. And I guess that's all I'll say for now, but a discussion may be in the works with Tori about this book, and it is book one in a series. So I'll just leave it at that. So that's it for the books I read in the month of August. I noticed that there was a little bit of a romance thing going on with the books I read, including The Day Boy and the Night Girl, White Nights, and a little bit with the Prydain book that I read. And also, I noticed that I was drawn to classics in August, which is a good thing. I would really like to get into classics a little bit more, even though it's a little bit of a stretch to call the Prydain book a classic. I think it was written in the 60s or 70s. I should look that up. But certainly Dostoyevsky counts as a classic, and I would say The Day Boy and the Night Girl too, as it was published in 1879. But one question I will leave you with, based on my inspiration, my gem of the month, is, do you enjoy daydreaming? Because this whole entire discussion about being a dreamer, it made me think about how much time I've spent in life daydreaming, wandering around in my imagination, and using that to be creative, using that to create art or to enjoy music in a deeper way, or to journal. I've always enjoyed creative acts, and I think some of that comes from allowing my mind to wander, allowing my imagination to go places, to different directions. And I think that's also why I love fantasy as well, or fiction in general. So let me know, do you love to daydream, or are you somebody who tries really hard to stay firmly planted and in reality and not wander in your mind too much? And let me know if you've read any of the books I've mentioned, or if you're planning to read any of the books I've mentioned. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great rest of your day. Bye bye.